The call came on a morning that already felt too quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that hangs in the air when a family is holding its breath, bracing for the moment grief finally breaks through. Romy Reiner stared at her phone for a long time before she pressed the number. Her fingers didn't shake because she was unsure who to call. She knew exactly who she was calling. She knew exactly what this call would cost. When the line connected, she didn't rush. She didn't try to sound strong. Her voice came out soft, careful, as if speaking any louder might crack something fragile inside her. "Uncle Mel, today our family is holding the service for my dad. I really hope you can come." On the other end, there was silence. A long silence. So long that, for a second, Romy thought the call had dropped. She pulled the phone away to check the screen, then brought it back to her ear. Still nothing. And then finally, Mel Brooks's voice. Old, hoarse, like it had been scraped raw by sleepless nights and words he didn't want to say. "No, Romy, I can't." The firmness of it hit her like a door closing. Not slammed, not cruel, just final. Romy swallowed hard, fighting the sting rising behind her eyes. She didn't argue, she pleaded, gently, like she was trying to hold a trembling glass without shattering it. "You don't have to stay long. Uncle Mel, just sitting there for a moment would be enough." Mel let out a quiet sigh, the kind of sigh that doesn't come from the lungs, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere tired. "I've already lost Carl," he said slowly, each word falling heavy. "I can't stand in front of another coffin with the name Reiner on it. I'm sorry, truly sorry." Romy bit her lip. She tried to keep her voice steady, but her vision blurred anyway. "My dad always said you were the one who taught him how to make comedy," she whispered. "How to look at life through laughter. He cherished you so much. Just having you there, it would mean everything to our family." On the other end, Mel Brooks paused, as if he was searching for a way to answer without bleeding through the phone. "My dear," he said, "I already said goodbye to Rob in my heart." He mentioned the day Rob called him, still talking about new projects, still excited like he always was, like time hadn't stolen anything, like life was still generous. Mel's voice tightened, then softened again, as if he was trying to keep himself from breaking. "I don't want to appear and make everyone sadder," he continued. "Tell Jake that I love you all, and if you can, tell Rob and Michelle that I'll see them again soon, very soon." When the call ended, Romy lowered the phone so slowly, like it weighed more than it should. And somewhere else, far away from that quiet kitchen and that trembling hand, the Reiner family stepped into a private funeral held in near total silence. December 21st, a small chapel. Gray sky pressing down, cold wind swirling outside like it was looking for a way inside. No press, no flashing cameras, no crowd. Just sorrow packed tightly into every breath. Only the closest family members were allowed to enter, and one seat, the seat that many people expected to be filled, remained empty. Mel Brooks didn't come. At first, people accepted the simplest explanation. He was old, his health was declining, he didn't have the strength. On the surface, that sounded reasonable, even compassionate. But curiosity doesn't stay quiet for long, not when it senses a story behind the silence. Because this wasn't just anyone. This was Mel Brooks, a legend of comedy, a man who had shared friendship with the Reiner family for more than half a century, a man whose laughter had lifted millions, a man who had sat beside Carl Reiner through years of life, years of work, years of memories. So when he didn't show up, the question started as a whisper. Why? Then it grew. Why would a man who loved that family like his own refuse to attend the final memorial service? And the louder the question became, the more uncomfortable it got. Some people doubted him, some blamed him, others felt disappointed, repeating the same sentence again and again like a verdict. How could he not come? Mel Brooks saw it. He didn't respond right away. He stayed silent, as he'd grown used to doing whenever pain showed up at his door. But this time, silence didn't protect him. This time, it became a burden, because the truth behind his refusal wasn't just age. It wasn't just weakness. It was heavier than that. It was something he had carried for years, something he had seen with his own eyes. And when the pressure finally became too much, he agreed to explain, not at a podium, not in a public spectacle, through a person he trusted, a long-time familiar journalist, Anderson Cooper. What Mel shared wasn't the story people expected, because the real reason Mel Brooks didn't attend Rob Reiner's funeral didn't begin on December 21st. It began in a house in Brentwood, a house where Mel used to come for something simple, something ordinary, just to sit down and watch Jeopardy. A habit that should have been harmless, a habit that should have been comforting. But instead, it led him to witness something terrifying. And once you hear what he saw inside that house, you'll understand why standing in front of that coffin wasn't just painful to Mel Brooks. It was unbearable. The house in Brentwood looked exactly the way it always had. Quiet street, neatly trimmed hedges, sunlight filtering through tall windows in the late afternoon, casting long shadows across the living room floor. For Mel Brooks, walking through that front door never felt like visiting someone else's home. It felt like stepping into a shared memory. Decades of laughter still seemed to cling to the walls, lingering in the corners like echoes that refused to fade. This was where Carl Reiner used to sit, right there on the couch, remote in one hand, a grin already forming before the first question appeared on the screen. Jeopardy was their ritual, not because it was exciting, not because either of them needed to prove how smart they were, but because it gave them something simple, something normal, something untouched by Hollywood, deadlines, or legacy. Two old friends, a couch, a game show. For years, Mel would come over just before evening. Carl would already be waiting, pretending not to care whether Mel showed up on time, but always lighting up the moment he did. They would argue over answers, laugh at the absurd clues, tease each other mercilessly when one of them got something wrong. Those evenings mattered more than either of them admitted. And after Carl passed, Mel kept coming. At first, it felt strange, painful, but Mel believed that if he kept the routine alive, somehow Carl would still be there. Not physically, but close enough to feel. So he sat in the same spot. He watched the same show. He answered the same questions. And then, slowly, as something changed, one evening, Mel noticed Rob sitting quietly nearby, not joining in, not laughing, just watching. At first, Mel didn't think much of it. Grief looks different on everyone. Some people fill silence with words, others drown in it. But as days turned into weeks, the silence grew heavier. Rob began forgetting small things, names, details, the punchline of stories he had told 100 times before. Mel tried to ignore it. He told himself it was exhaustion, stress, the weight of losing a father who had been his hero. Until one night, something happened that Mel couldn't explain away. The clue flashed on the screen, an easy one. Something Rob would have answered instantly in the past. Mel glanced over, expecting to hear Rob shout the answer before the contestants even buzzed in. But Rob didn't move. He stared at the screen like it was written in another language. Seconds passed. Then Rob turned to Mel, confusion etched across his face, and asked softly, almost embarrassed, "What show is this?" The room went still. Mel felt his chest tighten. "It's Jeopardy," Mel replied gently, forcing a smile. Rob nodded slowly, like the answer helped, but his eyes didn't change. They stayed distant, searching, as if he were trying to remember where he was. That night, Mel went home shaken. He didn't say anything to anyone, not to family, not to friends. He didn't want to believe what his mind was already whispering, but the moments kept coming. Rob repeating the same question minutes apart. Rob losing track of conversations halfway through a sentence. Rob laughing at jokes he didn't understand simply because everyone else was laughing. Each visit chipped away at Mel's heart because Mel had seen this before. He had watched Carl change in his final years. He had watched memory slip through his friend's fingers like sand, no matter how tightly he tried to hold on. And now, sitting in that same house on that same couch, Mel realized something that terrified him. This wasn't just grief. This was the beginning of the same slow goodbye. Mel stopped coming over as often, not because he didn't care, but because every visit felt like witnessing the future in real time. And Mel Brooks, a man who built an entire career on laughter, found himself powerless against something no joke could soften. By the time Rob Reiner passed away, Mel already felt like he had been mourning him for years. So when Romy asked him to sit beside another coffin, another Reiner name carved into wood, Mel wasn't being cold. He was protecting what little strength he had left, because standing there wouldn't have been a farewell. It would have been reopening a wound that never truly closed. And this was the truth Mel shared quietly later when people began to judge him. But even that wasn't the full story, because there was one final memory, one moment so painful that Mel had never spoken about it publicly. A moment that sealed his decision forever. The last time Mel Brooks saw Rob Reiner clearly, the sun was already setting. The light in the Brentwood house had turned soft and golden, the kind that usually made everything feel warmer, gentler. But that evening, it only made the silence more noticeable. Jeopardy was on, as always. The familiar music played, but it no longer carried the same comfort. It filled the room like background noise, something neither of them was truly listening to anymore. Mel sat on the couch, answering questions out of habit. His voice sounded loud in the quiet room. Too loud. Rob sat across from him, holding a mug that had long gone cold. His fingers gripped it tightly as if it were anchoring him to something real. At first, they didn't speak. Then Rob suddenly looked up and smiled. It was a warm smile, polite, almost formal, the kind of smile you give a stranger. Mel felt his stomach drop. "Nice to meet you," Rob said. Just 4 words, but they landed like a punch to the chest. Mel froze. He didn't laugh. He didn't correct him right away. He just stared at the man in front of him, searching his face for some sign of recognition, some flicker that said this was a mistake. There was none. Mel swallowed hard and forced himself to speak gently. "It's me, Rob," he said softly. "Mel?" Rob blinked. His smile faltered for just a second. Confusion crept in, followed by something worse. Fear. "Oh," Rob murmured. "Of course, I'm sorry. My head's been a mess." Mel nodded quickly, pretending it was nothing. pretending his heart wasn't breaking apart piece by piece. They sat there in silence again. Jeopardy ended. The credits rolled, and Mel knew with a certainty that scared him that this was goodbye. Not the kind of goodbye where people hug and promise to call. Not the kind where there are speeches or tears in public. This was the quiet goodbye, the one where you leave without saying anything because saying it out loud would make it real. When Mel stood up to go, Rob didn't stop him. He didn't ask when Mel would come back. He didn't say goodbye. He just watched as Mel walked toward the door, already drifting somewhere Mel couldn't follow. That night, Mel went home and cried, not the dramatic kind of crying people imagine, just silent tears falling slowly as he sat alone, thinking about Carl, about Rob, about how cruel time could be. From that day on, Mel stopped visiting, not out of anger, not out of neglect, but because he wanted to remember Rob the way he was, sharp, funny, passionate, a man who argued, laughed, created, and challenged the world, not the man who looked at him like a stranger. So when the funeral day arrived, Mel didn't need to see the coffin to say goodbye. He had already said it. He had said it in that living room, under that fading sunlight, when Rob's eyes no longer recognized him, and that was why Mel Brooks stayed away. Because grief, when repeated too many times, doesn't make you stronger. It empties you. And Mel had already lost Carl. He couldn't lose Rob all over again in front of an audience. He chose to remember them both alive, laughing, arguing over wrong answers on Jeopardy. Two friends frozen in time, untouched by memory's cruel erasure. That was the goodbye Mel Brooks could survive, and that was the goodbye he chose. After the funeral, the noise didn't fade. It grew. Articles appeared, comments piled up. People who had never sat on that couch, never watched those quiet evenings dissolve into confusion, began to pass judgment. Some called Mel Brooks distant, others called him selfish. A few went even further, questioning his loyalty, his friendship, even his character. How could he not show up? They were like family. He owed Rob that. Mel read none of it at first. He had learned long ago that public outrage is loud, but understanding is rare. Still, the weight of it pressed on him. Not because he doubted his choice, but because he knew how easily silence could be mistaken for indifference. And this time, silence felt like a betrayal to the truth. So Mel did something he almost never did. He agreed to speak, not in a press conference, not in a long interview filled with sound bites, but in a quiet conversation with someone who knew how to listen. When Anderson Cooper asked him why he didn't attend the service, Mel didn't start with age or health. He didn't hide behind excuses. He told the truth, slowly, carefully. He spoke about Carl, about how watching a friend fade while still breathing is a different kind of death, one that doesn't arrive all at once, but it steals pieces over time. He spoke about Rob, about the confusion, the forgotten faces, the moment when recognition disappeared from Rob's eyes, and then Mel said something that will stop the room. Some people think funerals are for the dead, he said quietly. They're not. They're for the living, and sometimes the living just can't take it anymore. He explained that standing in that chapel wouldn't have honored Rob as he remembered him. It would have trapped Mel in the final image of loss, instead of the decades of life that came before it. Mel wasn't afraid of death, he was afraid of erasing memory, because once memory goes, that's when people truly disappear. By staying away, Mel wasn't rejecting Rob. He was protecting him, protecting the version of Rob who debated the scripts late into the night, who argued passionately about politics, comedy, and culture, who laughed loudly, lived loudly, and never sat quietly unless he was thinking of his next idea. That was the Rob Mel chose to carry with him, not the man fading into confusion. Anderson didn't interrupt. He let the silence sit. Because some explanations don't need defending, they just need to be heard. When the interview ended, Mel didn't feel relief, but he felt lighter, because the truth was no longer his alone. And slowly, the judgment softened. People began to understand that grief doesn't follow rules, that love doesn't always look like showing up. Sometimes it looks like knowing when you can't. Still, there was one final thought Mel shared, one line that summed up everything, a line that explained why he has stayed away better than any story ever could. He said, "I didn't miss Rob's funeral. I missed him long before that." What Mel Brooks didn't say out loud that day was the hardest part of all, because grief doesn't end when the interview is over. It doesn't disappear once the truth is explained. It lingers quietly in the moments no one sees. Late at night, Mel would still think about that couch, the way Carl used to lean forward when a question came up he knew for sure, the way Rob used to jump in, confident, sometimes wrong, but always eager to argue his case. Those weren't just memories, they were proof of life. Mel understood something most people don't realize until it's too late. Funerals freeze a person in their final moment, but memory keeps them alive exactly as they were. And Mel refused to let Rob be reduced to a single image, a coffin, a date, a closing chapter. To Mel, Rob was still alive in the debates they never finished, in the projects they talked about but never made, in the jokes that only made sense to the three of them, Carl, Rob, Mel, a triangle of friendship built on laughter, sharpened by honesty and held together by time. By the time Rob passed, Mel felt like the world was asking him to grieve on command, to perform sadness the way people expected it to look. But grief doesn't work like that. Real grief is private, messy, uneven. Sometimes it looks like staying home instead of showing up. Sometimes it looks like protecting yourself from a pain you know will break you. Mel knew that if he stood in that chapel, surrounded by faces full of sorrow, he wouldn't be remembering Rob's life. He would be reliving his decline. And Mel had already lived that once with Carl. He couldn't survive it again. So instead, on the day of the funeral, Mel did something no one saw. He sat alone, he turned on the television, and when the familiar Jeopardy theme played, he smiled through tears. He answered questions out loud, just like before. He laughed at the wrong answers. And for a brief moment, in that quiet room, time bent. Carl was back on the couch, Rob was arguing again, and Mel wasn't alone. That was his goodbye. Not public, not dramatic, but honest. And in the end, that mattered more than any seat in a chapel ever could. In the weeks that followed, the world slowly moved on. News cycles shifted. Headlines changed. Attention drifted elsewhere, as it always does. But for Mel Brooks, time didn't rush forward. It circled. Every laugh he heard carried an echo. Every clever line reminded him of the conversations that once stretched late into the night. Comedy, the thing that had given his life meaning, now felt like a bridge to the people he loved most. People often say that legends don't grieve the way ordinary people do. They're wrong. Legends just learn how to grieve quietly. Mel didn't need a funeral to confirm what Rob meant to him. He didn't need a chair in the front row or a speech written in advance. His tribute wasn't measured in applause or attendance. It lived in memory, in loyalty, in the refusal to let the final image define the entire story. Because Rob Reiner was never just the man at the end of his life. He was the man who challenged ideas, who believed deeply, who laughed loudly, who lived with conviction, even when it cost him. And Mel Brooks chose to honor that man by remembering him whole. Years from now, when people talk about Mel Brooks, they'll talk about his films, his jokes, his fearless comedy. But those who truly understand him will remember something else. They'll remember a man who knew when love meant showing up and when love meant staying away. Because sometimes the most powerful goodbye is the one no one else sees. Sometimes the greatest act of friendship is protecting the memory of who someone was, instead of surrendering it to how they ended. And that is why Mel Brooks didn't attend Rob Reiner's funeral, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much.